Orthodox Radio Crusade. Anarchism for the global city. Radical environmentalism for the concrete jungle. Esoteric explorations of the secret history of rebel culture. The Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. Exiled from WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City. Now only on the World Wide Web. Be there.
So, last week I was ranting about the fact that, very disturbing fact, that I am seeing the exact same propaganda that we are getting from El Pendejo, as I call him, the Republican presidential candidate, the exact same nonsense that we're getting from him that Obama and Hillary were the founders of ISIS. I'm also getting from my left-wing friends or supposed left-wing friends, quote-unquote, on Facebook. And I'm actually seeing, this exact same allegation being made on supposedly leftist or progressive websites. And one just disturbing example of this sort of fusion of right and left, which seems to be going on at the moment, which is not good. And I just thought I would clear the air on this whole question. Now, like most powerful propaganda, it's always got, the big lie has always got to be built on a little grain of truth. But this particular grain of truth is particularly ironic, because the only sense in which President Obama can be said to have created ISIS is in his precipitous withdrawal from Iraq, being in a hurry to follow through on his campaign promise to get the United States out of Iraq. He just sort of left everything in the hands of Nouri al-Maliki, who was then the Prime Minister of Iraq, despite the fact that he was basically a Shiite supremacist and was persecuting Sunnis and excluding them from political life and so on. And by leaving him in power, it was just going to play into the hands of the Sunni hotheads and extremists, and basically undo all of the progress which the U.S. had made in pacifying the Sunni insurgency over the past few years. Progress, I should point out, which was not really made through bullets, but made through bribes and actually, buying off the Sunni militias and wooing them away from Al Qaeda and turning them into a sort of a proxy force for the regime through the so-called awakening movement. All of that, obviously, all of that progress was just immediately reversed when al-Maliki was left to his own devices. And this is what led to the revival of the Sunni insurgency, which ultimately led to ISIS. So the notion that this sort of conspiranoid notion, which is popular on the right and on the left, that that Obama or the CIA or Mossad or whoever intentionally created ISIS as some kind of a false flag operation or some kind of provocation. No, there's no evidence to suggest that at all. That is sheer wackiness. Now, creating ISIS in the larger sense, through in the more vague sense, the more metaphorical sense of creating the conditions which led to ISIS, well, yes. And that actually, maybe, a certain percentage of that lies with Obama for his, leaving Maliki in power during the so-called, U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, which was not even a complete withdrawal because there were still several hundred military advisors who stayed and several thousand military contractors who stayed. So a pseudo withdrawal more than a real withdrawal. But okay, maybe a certain amount of that blame can be laid with Obama for leaving Maliki in power with the pseudo withdrawal from Iraq in 2011. But a far greater share of the blame obviously lies with George Bush for going into Iraq in the first place. And the more rational elements of the anti-war left in the United States will make that case, not the conspiranoid case that ISIS was intentionally created by the CIA or whatever, which is just nonsense. But make the more rational case that the U.S. actually created the conditions which led to the emergence of ISIS through the U.S. invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush. And yeah, that's true. But the people who make that analysis, which is legitimate as far as it goes, are only looking at one half of the equation, because ISIS is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And the destabilization of Iraq under the U.S. invasion and occupation is around 50% of the political context which led to the emergence of ISIS. The other 50%, which they don't want to look at, is the brutal and now I would say genocidal repression of the Bashar Assad regime in Syria, which also has targeted Sunnis in for persecution and sectarian cleansing, shall we say, which is what got the Sunnis radicalized in Syria. So, if you're going to talk about the U.S. creating the conditions for the Sunnis getting radicalized in Iraq, okay, fine, I agree. But that's half of the equation of what created the political conditions which led to ISIS. And the other half of the equation, which all the peaceniks in the United States don't want to look at, is what Bashar Assad has been doing to his own people in Syria over the past 5 years, going on 5 years now. So to actually go through the history, if you recall, if you've actually been following it for the past 10 years and change, as I have on my website, countervortex.org, you will recall that the Sunni insurgency emerged in Iraq almost immediately upon the start of the U.S. occupation in 2003. Seems like an awful long time ago now. And eventually it congealed around a body called the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI, or ISI, Islamic State in Iraq, under the leadership of Abu Musab Zarqawi, who in 2006 apparently was killed. And it was soon after that through the so-called awakening movement, a lot of that insurgency was domesticated or pacified or bought off by the occupation and by the regime, and the insurgency started to go into abeyance, and then, as I say, it began to re-emerge again once Nur al-Maliki was left to his own devices and began persecuting the Sunnis and excluding them from political life and so on. And then it began to emerge once again. And then, at the same time, mind you, that all of that was going on with Maliki in Iraq, you had Bashar Assad in Syria, starting with the beginning of the Syrian revolution in 2011, doing far, far worse things in Syria, which led to the Sunnis getting radicalized in Syria. And you had the emergence of the Nusra Front. Now, both the Islamic State in Iraq and the Nusra Front were at least nominally loyal to Al-Qaeda. And at a certain point in 2013, they decided to link up. And ISI, by now under the leadership of Abu Bakr Baghdadi, the so-called Caliph of ISIS today, sends their guys across the border into Syria, and they tried to sort of do a hostile takeover of the Nusra Front. And there was some jockeying and rivalry going on for a while as to who's going to get the franchise. Is it going to be, who's going to get the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria? Is it going to be ISI, now renamed ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or is it going to be the Nusra Front? And eventually the Al-Qaeda central command, as it were, the central leadership in Pakistan or Afghanistan, or wherever they're hiding out, the people around Zawahiri, decide that that the Nusra Front is going to get the franchise, and that Baghdadi's people are going to have to accept their leadership. And Baghdadi's people say, no, we're taking our ball and we're going home. And they broke from the Nusra Front and they broke from Al-Qaeda, and they declared themselves to be the Islamic State. And eventually they even dropped the Islamic State in ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. They're now just calling themselves the Islamic State, and they're pretending to be the Caliphate and blah, blah, blah. I don't like to use any of these words. I particularly find it galling to use the word ISIS, because ISIS was actually the name of an Egyptian Earth Mother goddess, and I don't want to sully her name. And nonetheless, I use the word ISIS just because everybody else does, even though it's really not accurate. People in the Middle East, in the Arab world, call them Daesh, which is a word that they don't like. It's actually what the acronym Islamic State comes out in Arabic, but it actually is a verb meaning to trample underfoot, which is, I understand, which is very unflattering for ISIS, and they don't like it, and they just want to be called the Islamic State. But so that's what the people who don't like them, which is of course the big majority of the people in both Syria and Iraq, they call them Daesh, and that's what I wish I could call them. I wish that that name would be more popularized, but because everybody calls them ISIS, I want people to know what I'm talking about, so I call them ISIS. So anyway, you hear an awful lot of, from the peddlers of conspiracy, you hear an awful lot of nonsense and distorted claims about ISIS or Daesh or whatever you want to call them. They will always jump on the fact that they're fighting with U.S. weapons, fighting with U.S. supplied weapons. This is true, but the weapons were not supplied directly to them. The weapons were supplied to the Iraqi army, which was by and large a fiction, and notoriously it collapsed when in June of 2014 ISIS took the city of Mosul. The army fled, and they left behind all of their guns, left behind all their weaponry. That's how all of those U.S.-made guns wound up in the hands of ISIS, not because the U.S. was actually supplying them directly to ISIS. Come on. Then there's all this talk about this report from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, which I believe came out in just about the time that ISIS was emerging, maybe about 2011, 2012, which was predicting the emergence of a Sunni emirate or a Sunni extremist principality in Syria. And people are jumping on this to saying that, that was the plan all along. But if you actually read the text of the DIA report, it's not advocating this thing. It's not saying, this is our plan and what we're going to bring about. No, on the contrary, it's warning against it. And in fact, interestingly enough, the head of the DIA, when that report was being made, was General Michael Flynn, who is now a foreign policy advisor to El Pendejo's campaign. And interestingly enough, he actually met with the Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein when they were in Moscow together for a confab hosted by the Kremlin state media propaganda mouthpiece RT. So once again, this very strange alliance going on of the right and the left. And, isn't it funny that, the same people who are going to, point to this DIA report as evidence that, the U.S. secretly was behind ISIS from the start, which is not what the report says, they're the same people who are going to vote, for a lot of them, for Jill Stein, who actually sat down and had dinner with, Michael Flynn, the same guy under whose auspices the report was prepared. And by the way, Vladimir Putin was also at that dinner. So it's all rather bizarre. And then there is also the question of, there's foreign powers involved, which, other than the United States, which are still allied with the United States and supported by the United States, which have also been accused of backing ISIS. And I want to, make clear that the meddling of foreign powers in the Syrian conflict has been overwhelmingly destructive. But there is also a lot of nonsense about, it's a lot of nonsense theorizing going on about, various other regional powers supporting ISIS. And you hear over and over again that Saudi Arabia is supporting ISIS. There actually isn't any evidence to suggest it whatsoever. Saudi Arabia is undoubtedly supporting a lot of the more conservative, Islamist, Sunni militias in Syria, but not ISIS, the ones which are in fact integrated under the loose umbrella of the Free Syrian Army and are in fact fighting ISIS. And in fact, ISIS has repeatedly attacked Saudi Arabia. ISIS has, repeatedly attacked the forces that Saudi Arabia is backing in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia is waging its own really brutal, horrific war and doing the same kind of atrocities in Yemen that Bashar Assad is doing in Syria. So I am not here to exonerate Saudi Arabia by any stretch of the imagination. But they are not backing ISIS. And you also hear frequently that Qatar is backing ISIS. I believe there's a certain amount of evidence that Qatar may be backing the Nusra Front, but not ISIS. And now the Nusra Front is also at odds with ISIS, for actually fighting ISIS, for not with ISIS. And then, the more credible claims are that Turkey has been backing ISIS. And this brings us into the whole Kurdish question. I do believe that there actually is evidence to suggest that Turkey has been sort of quietly conniving with ISIS and sort of, giving ISIS leeway to do its dirty work of fighting the revolutionary Kurds in northern Syria, because Turkey, quite famously, has a large, Kurdish population within its own national territory and does not want to give them autonomy and is afraid of Kurdish ethnic nationalism and Kurdish revolutionary aspirations. So I do believe that even though now it looks like the breaking point has come with Turkey's actual invasion of northern Syria, I believe that it is actually credible that Turkey has sort of been conniving with ISIS, allowing them to use Turkish territory as a rear ground and allowing them to, protecting their smuggling routes to sell their black market oil and so on. But I don't think that Turkey has been doing this as a U.S. puppet or a U.S. proxy. I think that Turkey has actually been doing this for its own perceived interest. And when I say Turkey, of course, I mean Erdogan and the Turkish state. Been doing this for their own perceived interest, and the United States has been trying to rein them in. Of course, the U.S. can't afford to completely alienate Turkey, important NATO ally and all of that. But it should be noted that the United States has actually been backing the Syrian Kurds, because the Syrian Kurds are the most effective force on the ground to fight ISIS. So a lot of people think that the reason now that the United States has actually got special forces troops embedded with the Kurdish forces in northern Syria is precisely to restrain Turkey from bombing them. So I think that the United States has probably been exerting pressure on Turkey behind the scenes not to engage in this kind of connivance with ISIS. So once again, the most critical error that so-called leftists or progressives make in their entire approach to the question of Syria is not actually looking at the Syrians as autonomous actors who actually are capable of thinking, analyzing, acting, and fighting on their own, but only viewing them as pawns, of outside powers or as victims of U.S. imperialism. and not actually viewing them as people who are capable of actually starting a revolution and continuing through that revolution. And in fact, there are, as horrific as the situation in Syria has become, there continues to be, even now, forces on the ground in Syria which are entirely worthy of our support and which in fact demand our solidarity. You've got the Kurds in their northern enclave called Rojava, who have actually established a secular, progressive, pro-feminist autonomous zone, and are again the most effective force on the ground fighting ISIS. And you have also got the civil resistance movement, which continues to exist even now, which is anti-sectarian, pro-democratic, autonomist among the Arab majority of Syria as well. And most of the the so-called leftist or progressive or anti-war forces in this country are completely blind to the fact that these movements even exist. And many of them are increasingly, instead of supporting our natural allies on the ground, the progressive, pro-democratic, anti-dictatorship, secularist forces in Syria, instead they're rallying around the genocidal dictatorship of Bashar Assad in the name of stability in this unlikely convergence between the right and the left. And in our next episode of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade YouTube vlog, we will be looking at this whole question of this extremely sinister convergence of the left and the right, which is going on in this country right now. But the last thing I want to do before I sign off is provide some resources for people who are actually interested in getting real information about news that you can use about Syria. For starters, I've got just 3 books. Maybe on another show I'll talk about some books looking more at the general Syrian revolution. But I've got 3 books now that I want to promote, looking primarily at the Kurdish revolution, which is going on in Syria, in Rojava, the northern Syrian enclave. One, A Road Unforeseen, Women Fight the Islamic State by Meredith Tax. And 2 collections of essays and documents about the Kurdish revolution in Syria, which have come out in the past year. One of which I am a contributor to Dare Imagining Rojava Revolution from Autonomedia. I've actually got an essay in this book. And A Small Key Can Open a Large Door, the Rojava Revolution. All these books are series of essays and documents about the Kurdish resistance in Syria and why we should support it. And online resources, you want what I consider to be reliable news coming from a progressive perspective on Syria. Well, not to toot my own horn too much, but my own website, countervortex.org. I blog about autonomy struggles all over the world, with a big emphasis these days on what's going on in Syria. And then if you go to my links page, you will find several other websites under Syria, which will give you good, reliable news from a progressive perspective. I'm just going to point out a few of them. One is, a website produced by radical left revolutionaries in Syria, explicitly anti-imperialist, Syria Freedom Forever, which is at syriafreedomforever.wordpress.com. General support for the Syrian Spring at adoptarevolution.org. Citizensforsyria.org. Also, general support for civil resistance in Syria, civil opposition, pro-democracy action. And Syria Deeply, which is actually at newsdeeply.com/Syria. Get that? newsdeeply.com/Syria for Syria Deeply. And finally, if you particularly want to get up to speed on the Kurdish angle in Syria, Well, you can go to the site of Rojava Solidarity NYC, which is at supportrojava.org. And if you click on the link there for news sites, it will take you to several other news sites, as you might imagine, specifically about the Syrian revolution, the Kurdish revolution in Syria, actually produced by people on the ground, independent Kurdish media. So this is really what I recommend. Just getting back to the theme that I was talking about last week of how the so-called alternative media in the United States has become nearly as problematic as the dreaded MSM mainstream media. Well, what I recommend is that people don't go either primarily for your information to New York Times, Washington Post, blah blah blah, nor to Counterpunch and Global Research and all these other scurrilous pseudo-left websites, as I would call them, but actually go to websites which are actually produced by people who are in the region, on the ground, or closely in touch with in the region and on the ground, and they're actually committed to supporting people in the region and on the ground who are fighting for the same things in Syria that we are fighting for here in New York City and the United States, which is to say democracy, popular empowerment, and revolution. Although the revolution going on in Syria is a real one. Anyway, I'll just leave you with that. And once again, my website is countervortex.org, and don't forget to like and subscribe.